And Taryn, if I could just trouble you, are you waiting for a few more participants?
You can go ahead and get started.
Okay, very good. So I want to welcome everyone who's participating tonight in our conversation about learning loss. My name is Arla Cahill. I'm an attorney at a law firm called Mandelbaum Salzberg in Roseland, New Jersey. And I'm really pleased to introduce you also to my co-speaker tonight, Melanie Feller. And Melanie, why don't you just give a little bit of background on what you do real quickly, and then we'll get into our program.
Thank you, Arla. Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Feller. I am a developmentally based pediatric speech pathologist, a DIR floor time provider, and an infant mental health specialist. And I have a private practice here in New Jersey where I specialize in working with children with the very young, under 3, with children who have autism spectrum challenges, and for children who need evaluations related to litigation purposes. So for parents, for example, that are having some struggles with their school district, they might ask me to do the evaluations for their litigation process. I'm excited to be here and excited to present with Arla, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion tonight.
Wonderful. So part of what I do is special education law. And one of the things that has come to my attention probably as recently as, right after the shutdown last year for the, the pandemic shutdown, parents came to me concerned very much about, getting services for their children. Schools were closed, and even until very recently, schools have been operating virtually or by way of hybrid. And, there are just a few more schools that still haven't reopened. And a topic that is on everyone's mind is learning loss. And just to give a little, non-technical definition of learning loss, it's where there's been a regression of skills or academics that have been learned that are no longer part of the repertoire of the students' mastered skills and knowledge. And under ordinary circumstances, learning loss is something that educators expect to happen during school breaks, particularly over the summer. And there's quite a bit of scholarly research by educators about learning loss and what to do about it. And now, we're confronted with the situation of having an extended closure of school, where school has been transferred. Literally, teachers had to pivot with very few days' notice to develop strategies to present models of education that, frankly, it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. And unfortunately, students with special needs have suffered, I think, more so than others. And Melanie, you've worked with school districts and continue to do that. What have you seen in terms of the impact that the last 12 months have had, or 12 months, 13 months have had on our educational services for students with special needs, special education students?
I think it's been a remarkable impact. I've seen students who don't get enough services, who don't get any services, who are offered in-person services only for related services and nothing more. IEP mandates not being met or sort of being met, just really the gamut of a really robust, remote/hybrid program to really lacking, and really a complete lack of education, in the guise of remote learning, which is really unfortunate. And I think really has impacted our students, in ways that we wouldn't have even considered a year ago.
Yes, that's absolutely, that's consistent with what I'm being told by parents as well. And so tonight, Melanie and I want to have basically a conversation about techniques and tips on how we can assist families in addressing these issues. A lot of this has been beyond our control, but there are ways where we can regain control over the situation. And one of the, topics that I think is very important, even before we get into sort of like the academics and measurements and things like that, is the social and emotional impact that isolation that has impacted students who are learning virtually. That learning is really an interactive process, and although some students can benefit from interacting on a computer screen, there are a great many students who have difficulty with that because they're more accustomed to hands-on approach and having the teacher nearby, other students to model. And that's really the focus of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is to have students integrated with non-disabled peers, typically developing peers, to model those behaviors. And here we've had a year of no modeling, no interaction. And what are your thoughts on that, Melanie?
It's so concerning, the lack of, as you said, not having in-person instruction is very detrimental, I think, to a lot of our students, putting aside the complexity of COVID, needing social distancing, et cetera. Just looking at the student and what they need, it can be really hard not having that in-person support, that, like you said, that social, emotional, those interactions that you have with peers, with your teachers, even just, once you go in person, like I work somewhere where the children have to wear masks. I have to wear a mask. And these are children who have really significant social, emotional challenges. They're looking to your face to get some sort of read on what you're saying, because obviously your affect and your expressions kind of support, the thing that you're actually vocalizing. And it's very, very difficult. I think that the impact has been pretty significant, actually, for a lot of kids. And I think that's something we're going to have to work through and unravel as we move back to in-person, and how we can sort of support that, in a way that really suits the individual child to really not even catch up, but really just progress forward in a reasonable manner.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, the social, emotional well-being is tied to learning. And one of the tips that I would offer families is to reach out to not only your school, but your community, and develop ways that your child can be involved more in socialization type scenarios, particularly now that we have more vaccinations occurring, where there's opening up of access to public places, and also, reintegration of students back into, a functioning community again. It's so important for families to, take some day trips, or go to the park, or contact, some neighbors or friends for play dates to get that interaction started. And I know from, personal experiences, students are initially shy. They are intimidated because they've been in the situation where maybe it's just all adults in the home, or just, siblings in the home. So, maybe starting slowly, just that reintroduction back into everyday life, going to the store, for example, is a social interaction. That park, walking the dog, all of these things, like, we can break them down into small bites that are comprehensible to a student who has sensory issues and issues relating to adjusting with, in the presence of other people, so you want to gauge that, obviously, based on the abilities of the child, right? Melanie, you wouldn't, depending on the child, everything's individualized.
Of course. Yeah. And I think you make such a good point. Simple little outings like walking the dog, going to the grocery store. It doesn't have to be like a set play date where you're, trying to organize a very specific activity. It can just be something fun. Playing with your child is really great outside. Maybe there's a neighbor, maybe there's, someone else that can just kind of an informal interaction. The goal is, I think, to get as many interactions that are within a safe, reasonable, obviously, situation for the specific family. But really, interactions would be so helpful at this point, in person, live, where the child can really benefit from being around others. I think is so beneficial and so needed at this point.
With your specialty in play therapy, do you have any suggestions that families can utilize to incorporate play into learning? There's so many studies that show that, developing play skills really helps with the development of neural networks and speech development. I mean, it's just fantastic. So I'm curious to know what tips you might have related to that.
So there's so many things you can do with play. And as you said, Arla, it's really, play can support learning, speech, social skills, everything. Play is just a really great way to get down to the child's level and really interact with them in the things that they love, which will naturally foster growth and development, because you're entering the world of the child instead of perhaps yanking the child out of their world into yours. It's kind of like a meeting of the minds in the middle. So that can be very appealing to a child, maybe that's had to sit in front of a computer all day, or, do some sort of like rote work over and over again. All of a sudden you're doing something they enjoy. And that can be so appealing to them. Like, wow, what I love matters to this adult or this, other person in my life. And that by having a meaningful activity that will really help support development. So that activity doesn't have to be like a structured, play. Well, now we're going to do, this play and then that play. Like, it could just be something, whatever your child enjoys, that's safe and obviously, reasonable within the confines of your home. But I'm thinking about like children perhaps who I'm just thinking of a child that came to mind who really enjoyed like playing with like little caps of things. And for him, that was a great play activity. It wasn't really purposeful, but for him, it was very purposeful and just joyful and delightful. And it was helpful for him sometimes to have mom join in with that, because, even though mom was like, what are we doing here? He would talk to her about it, like, 2 caps, 3 caps, 4 caps. And all of a sudden they were talking a little bit about this thing he loved so much that wasn't a structured, rote activity. So I think it's really possible to sort of infuse language or learning or whatever you're trying to do within the context of play, if you're willing to be flexible and kind of think outside the box a little bit, which is not always easy. I'm not telling parents to sit on the floor for the next 4 hours and ignore their own, work and life, et cetera. But in those pockets of time where you have a little bit of time to sit with your child, or a caregiver, another caregiver, a sibling, a nanny, whoever might be with the child, can be really helpful just to have those moments of play where you're just kind of doing what the child wants and trying to figure out how you can maybe make it even more complex. Like, maybe I'm using the example of playing with the caps, maybe mom can have a few more caps in a box and he sees them and maybe he has to request them, or maybe you have to get them down from a high shelf. And how do you navigate that problem solving? There's just so many really wonderful ways to go. And at the end of our discussion today, I'll share some resources that parents can access, which might further their thoughts about play in the home.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is play therapy something that a layperson who doesn't have any specialized training could implement at their home for their child? Particularly, we have the summer coming.
Yes.
To me, like, that would be an ideal time to, explore one's environment and incorporate play into the outdoors.
Absolutely. It is a great time. I mean, anytime is a great time for play, but the summer especially, because like you said earlier, you can go outside, you can do all these cool things that you don't have access to inside. Maybe you have access to water or, your garden, or just the grass outside is great. So there are lots and lots of ways for parents to implement play. You do not need to be an expert. I think parents are truly the experts of their children, even if they need support from outside sources. Your child better than anyone else does. There are many, again, I'll share some resources at the end, but I'm thinking just of one website that has lots and lots of tips to support play that parents can easily implement, not hard, not expensive, and really can make a huge difference just from these little tiny things that seem so fun. And you're like, well, if it's that fun, then how can it be productive? But it is, because play is very productive. There's lots of research, like you were saying, Arla, on how important play is for children's development. So I think, yes, without question, this is a great summer to play, and it's always a great time to play. So I definitely think parents are more than capable of doing this.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I think parents feel, at least again, from anecdotal information that comes my way in my discussions with folks, is that families were really pressed to become the educators within their home during virtual learning. And I think that families felt perhaps that was outside the realm of what they knew, because we rely upon educators to do the educational part of the student's day. But I want to urge parents not to see the past year as a failure. The There may have been regression of skills, and some families who've registered tonight to attend this webinar have indicated that there's been regression of skills, loss of skills. I want to urge everyone to focus on what can be gained going forward. The loss of what future learning could be is really perhaps not the best focus. I think, if families want to recover from what's been a difficult year educationally and many other ways, I would recommend, and Melanie, you and I have discussed this too, that focusing on the goals and objectives that are in the IEP in the preceding school year or the existing school year is very helpful, because one of the ways to recover or to get gains going forward would be to look at those goals and objectives, and let's pick out some of those that are necessary as the building blocks for future learning. And in your delivery of services, Melanie, I'm sure you come across that even under ordinary circumstances, there are going to be years where a student hasn't progressed in their learning and mastery of their goals and objectives for their prior IEP. And encouragement of the student is certainly the way to go. But what other recommendations would you have to help families try to regain the losses and the loss of mastery of previously mastered goals and objectives?
And I think it's tricky. I think it's very individualized to the student. So I definitely don't want to give share something that could be seen as like a blanket. Everyone should do this. Like, that's not the point at all. I think everyone needs to consider their specific child and what they need.
And collaborate with, right?
Exactly. And collaborate with staff, with the people that are working with your child to figure out the best way to move forward. I do think, as a general overarching statement, I think that it's really important to think about the IEP goals that are most relevant to your child moving forward successfully in their academic career and beyond. So, and I'm thinking about, if there perhaps is a goal, and I'm just, again, this is very general, a goal for pronouns versus a goal for initiating a conversation, let's say. I would be very focused on the initiating a conversation goal, because that's a really critical skill for children, for anyone, to be an effective communicator. Pronouns are obviously very important, but maybe for that specific child, it is not critical to work on that in this moment in time. Maybe we'll revisit it later on in the next school year or something, because maybe right now that child really just needs to be able to say, hey, I need to use the restroom, or I need a drink, or I need help. Those are really critical things that might also impact behavior. So for example, if the child can't ask for help, maybe they start to have a meltdown because they can't express that something is wrong. So for me, that is a more urgent need than perhaps saying, the proper pronoun to a picture, let's say, because that's more like an isolated incident in time. And it's not as urgent to me as a need to say, I need some help before I have a really significant behavioral episode because I couldn't get the help I needed. So I hope that makes sense to everyone who's listening. I think it's important to pick. You're not picking and choosing, but I think you're considering the goals that are most meaningful, addressing those first, and then moving forward with any other goals that might not have been addressed fully as you proceed through, ESY and into the next school year. I think it is also really important to, like Arla was saying, collaborate with staff and see what staff have seen. So in the terms of speech therapy, like what has the speech therapist seen in terms of progress? If they're just rolling over the goals from last year to this year, is that necessarily appropriate? Yes, goals should be achieved within one academic year, but is it appropriate based on everything that's happened in these unusual circumstances? Is that what we need to do, or should only some goals be moved up, or should all of them? So I think it's important for everyone to take away that it's very individualized. You really need to consider what's right for your specific child in collaboration with the school team, and then move forward from there, obviously in consultation with any other experts that you feel are appropriate to support your situation. Are you finding that, Arla, in your practice, that parents have concerns about goals and what that looks like for the coming school year?
Yes.
How does that look to you?
Well, often, even pre-pandemic, parents are always concerned if they get an IEP at an IEP meeting or thereafter, and the goals and objectives either are identical or very similar. And I suspect that that's going to be a greater complaint in the coming year because of the lack of mastery in some situations. Ordinarily, like you say, the mastery should occur within that 1 year period, because if it doesn't, that should tell you that one, either the goal and objective was not appropriate. It was not reasonably calculated toward the student. It was not individualized. And that does happen. And that's not appropriate. Or in the situation where there has been a thoughtful creation of goals and objectives specific to the particular student pre-pandemic, and then during the course of the shutdown and the virtual learning, and even through most recent months, the ability for the educational providers to deliver what's necessary to support the educational goals just can't be replicated in a virtual setting. There are students who require hand over hand. They require modeling. And like you mentioned earlier, the looking at the facial expressions, very important. The occupational therapy for some time, students just were not getting it. That's a very hands-on therapy. So you're going to have situations where the goals and objectives as to those particular areas of learning are not going to be mastered. And rather than seeing it as a failure, I think I agree with you in terms of consulting with the educational professionals and delineating what is the most important. And it's really prioritizing, and it's not dismissing one thing over
exactly.
Prioritizing. And I like your example about, asking for help is a priority over perhaps learning a pronoun. And that's important in terms of building language, but what do we need immediately? And I think, it's appropriate for families to consider, this is sort of IEP season, May and June. And I think that it's appropriate for families whose children with IEP did not previously have an extended school year. It's absolutely appropriate to request that the school provide ESY services. That's something that is, necessary under ordinary circumstances to prevent regression of skills. And now that you've had 12, 13 months of an attenuated educational delivery, it's most certainly going to be the case in a lot of circumstances where you're going to have regression. And in New Jersey, at least, the New Jersey Department of Education notified school districts early on in last year in 2020 that school districts need to be prepared to address learning loss and to take appropriate measures to assist students in recovering the losses of academic skills and also mastering future learning, the prerequisites to future learning. So it's not confrontational, or it shouldn't be confrontational for you as parents to request your school districts, to request your case managers to put more in that IEP to address these issues. It's difficult for parents many times to have those conversations because we feel a little intimidated by school personnel. This is the time that you need to rely upon self-advocacy. I think that's an important takeaway in any case. And a lot of times I'll train parents on how to be their own self-advocate. And I'm sure, Melanie, you've dealt with the same thing because, learning as much as you can about your rights and appropriately addressing them. Not everything has to be a litigation. And that's really what I teach, clients, that it doesn't have to result in, Smith versus Brown or anything like that, or, that kind of thing. It's knowing your rights, researching. This is a year where parents are going to have to do a lot more hands-on research on what their child needs, and the communication, it has to be stepped up. The educators are specialists, and use them like a tool. Use their knowledge, request their knowledge, their input, and communication frequently. In fact, Melanie, I think prior to our conversation today, we were talking about ways that parents can communicate. If you could give a few examples, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one amazing way is to use a communication book between related services staff and between home. It's such a good way to find out what your child is doing in school, and to be able to communicate with the staff member without having to set up an actual time to meet or to Zoom or phone call. You can, respond in the notebook in the middle of the night, in the morning before you go to work. And that can be a really great way of staying on top of what's going on. It's really important that parents stay informed. As Arla was saying, self-advocacy is so critical, and it can feel like a really daunting task, I think, especially, you're walking into this room, there's a virtual room, there's a team of people. They ask you if you got the procedural safeguards book. You say, okay, even though you're not quite sure what that is. And when they hand you the book, it's like this, 20-page thing with small print, and it says, call this number if you have a problem. And that can be very overwhelming. You're already maybe stressed about your child and where they're going or where they're headed. And then you are faced with, maybe you're not so happy with what you're hearing. And then how do you sort of navigate that in a way that's supportive of your specific child, but also where perhaps it's kind of encouraging staff to interact with you and to engage with you and to participate, instead of maybe making it, like Arla was saying, litigious or confrontational. There are so many great ways to go around that and just work as a collaborative team. So I think a communication book is phenomenal. It's easy, it's inexpensive, it's not time consuming. Any related service professional should be happy to fill out a book really quickly. Johnny worked on goals 7 and 8 today. He did this and this. Let me know if you have any questions. And then mom can write back, oh, that's great. Or I don't understand. Can you explain more? And then obviously a meeting could be set up if there is further concern. So I think a communication book is great, and just staying informed. Make sure you know what services your child is supposed to be getting from the IEP. Everything is written into the IEP. When you have your IEP meeting, someone should sit down and explain to you what's in the IEP. It's not really that difficult in terms of a person taking the time to explain the basic points. Okay, Johnny is going to get speech therapy 3 times a week. See, it's on this line. And then, okay, I should be seeing in the communication book 3 notes from the speech therapist every week. And maybe one week you only see 1 note. And then maybe you can just reach out very casually, calmly. I hope everything's okay. I was wondering if he missed 2 sessions or if you forgot to write in the book or whatever it is. But make sure as a parent that you stay informed, that you know what's going on in school to the best of your ability. And if it's remote services where, it's all teletherapy, that's a little harder, right? Because then maybe you have to organize your child onto the computer and they don't want to participate. And so there's a level of complexity to, I think, related services since the pandemic started. That's really tricky to navigate. But I think the takeaway message for parents should be to stay informed and to try to communicate with staff as much as possible to the point where you feel like your child is getting what he or she needs, and you're working in collaboration with staff instead of anyone feeling like they're butting heads or, it's like a contentious relationship, because obviously we all want the same for the child, which is to progress and really, move ahead in their educational career.
Melanie, you bring up something I think is really important when you said, know which services your child is supposed to get. And I'll tell you, more often than not, I have parents come to me that say, it's just, they might have lost sight of let's say, certain therapies or the frequency of the delivery. I think it's very prudent to stay on top of whether or not services are being delivered. So let's say your child's supposed to get speech therapy 3 times a week for, 20 minutes individual and perhaps, 30 minutes group. And there's occupational therapy also that's involved. It's important for you to take the time to make sure that those therapies are actually being delivered. I've had parents come to me where they say, well, the therapist was out that day. She was sick. Well, okay, that's understandable. But there has to be a makeup session. And so if it's a 3 times a week, well, then let's pick another day. And I always say to parents, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And that's the parent that sends the email, makes the phone call, and says, my child didn't get his speech therapy today because his therapist was out sick. And how would you know that? Well, you might know it because the communication book doesn't have an entry from the speech therapist, or because you've developed a rapport with the case manager and you've kept in contact, you might have found out that the speech therapy wasn't delivered. Sometimes the child will let you know the speech therapy or whatever the related service wasn't delivered. And that's very important, to keep a log of what sessions are missed and make sure they're made up. One of the things I tell parents frequently is to put things in writing. Doesn't have to be a formal letter necessarily in every circumstance, but emails are a great way of memorializing telephone conversations and other understandings that you've come to in communicating with the case manager or other educational professionals that are expected to be delivering services. So, having the phone call, oftentimes I get, clients telling me that, well, we had this great conversation. They agreed with me. This is what's going to happen. But the next step, you got to put your mini lawyer hat on and write a letter or write an email saying, this will confirm we had a conversation today and you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And, this is how it's going to be. And that's great because, one, it's a reminder. You have to remember that educators have a lot of students on their caseload. They may forget. We're all guilty of that. We hang up the phone and that's it. It's out of our brain. Emails are great reminders. They're also great evidence in the future. Should there, unfortunately become a litigation situation, if you got all the emails that said, well, my son lost or missed this day of therapy, or, the bus, which is also related service, transportation didn't show up for, a couple weeks at a time. And I had to drive. So I want to be compensated for my time, not the time, but the travel. And, different ways where you can be exercising self-advocacy without having to be directly confrontational and accusatory, because this is a relationship that is going to be a long one. So if your child's very young, this is a relationship that you want to cultivate like you would with any other relationship. You want to be firm. You don't want to be abused. You don't want to be taken advantage of. And you want to get what's yours, what your right is. So I would encourage, keeping track of what is supposed to happen and asking. Just because at the IEP meeting, they tell you, this is what we're going to give you, this is what we're going to offer you. This is a collaborative process. The IEP is a document that's supposed to involve the viewpoints and opinions and recommendations from everybody, including the parent. Parent stands on equal footing. And the parent is also, entitled to say, well, you know what? I want this in the IEP. I want, one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is adaptive technology. One of the individuals who signed up for tonight's program had a question about, addressing the needs of nonverbal students. Well, adaptive technology is a terrific way to address that need and ask for an adaptive technology assessment. And I think, Melanie, in your practice, that's something that is fairly routine or recommended, right?
It is, yeah. And I am the first to suggest to parents that they consider an adaptive evaluation or an augmentative communication evaluation. There's lots of different terms and some focus a little bit differently. So sometimes the adaptive might look at different, for example, like a different type of writing situation or a computer for dictation or something. And whereas an AAC evaluation might look only at communication devices. So like, which would mean, I'm trying to think like Tobii Dynavox, if anyone's heard of that brand, or Proloquo to Go, any of those types of things that children can use to communicate if they are nonverbal or if they are verbal, but for whatever reason prefer to use a communication device instead of, or in addition to their voice. I think that is so critical for parents to know. They have every right to ask for that type of evaluation. It's really very nuanced in terms of AAC supports and what type of device is correct is right for a child. So what's right for Johnny may not be right for Susie, may not be right for Timmy. And I don't appreciate when I hear a district or an educator saying, oh, well, that's what we use in the district, because that doesn't always work for your child. So what ideally you would ask for is some type of adaptive tech or AAC evaluation. And a specialist would evaluate your child in the school and look and see what specifically benefits them. And that would mean showing them perhaps different devices and letting them navigate those devices in a way that suits the evaluation so that they can see exactly which device works really well for that student. And then ideally that device would be recommended and the process would move forward from there. But it's really important that all children have access to communication and a system of communication that's specifically individualized to them and not some sort of, well, this is what we use and that's the end of the story. Again, like Arla you were saying, this doesn't need to be contentious. It's perfectly fine for a parent to say, he hasn't been speaking. Speech therapy doesn't seem to be helping him speak any faster. It's been a year or however long it's been. I'd really love to see if we could get something in addition to what we're doing. So getting a device will not in any way take away from verbal language. There have been studies done that devices actually support verbal communication. And it can really help in terms of decreasing behaviors, increasing learning abilities, increasing participation. There's just so many benefits to AAC when it's done really well and when it's really individualized to the specific child. So I think you bring up a great point, with that, Arla.
Yeah, I had a situation once, a very profoundly disabled student, nonverbal, cerebral palsy, and like you mentioned, the Dynavox, that was sort of the go-to for the district. But for this particular student, because of the nature of the disability, that wasn't working. It was frustrating the student. So the student had this technology, was not benefiting from his education, was frustrated with the technology. And because of our intervention and writing a letter to the general counsel of that school district and really pushing the issue that this student needs an assessment and we need to figure out what would be a better way for this nonverbal student to communicate, because there was some limited function in the fingertips. And ultimately, we had one of the hospitals that does the assessment perform that assessment, and it turned out there were other technology devices for this student, for this particular problem that this student had. And what didn't work with the Dynavox worked with this other device, and then you could see like the ray of sun coming back into the child's face, because
exactly.
They're benefiting, they're communicating, they're participating. And every student, I think, wants to participate, wants to feel validated. And it's very, lacking validation not to be able to communicate.
Yeah.
Passion.
I just want to add, I'm sorry, Arla,
go ahead.
It's important for parents to know there are no precursors to being able to utilize a device. So there's no reason why an evaluation shouldn't take place, even if it's going to be a low-tech option that the district winds up using with the student, like PECs, which are the little picture exchange cards, which is just, for example, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like a picture of an apple and the child might give the picture of the apple to the adult to get the apple. And that's just a very, rough example. But there are no precursors to being able to have some sort of way to communicate. So just be aware of that. If someone says to you, well, he's not ready for that yet. He may not be ready for an iPad with apps on it, right? But maybe he's ready for some pictures or for some sign or whatever the case may be. Again, every child is individual and every case should be treated as such. But it's important to know that. Always feel free to advocate and maybe not necessarily back down if you hear, well, he's not ready for that type of evaluation, because I find, at least in my experience, which is pretty extensive at this point, there's really never a reason to not do an evaluation. Even if it says there's nothing except a pen and a paper right now that will help, something can always benefit the child, I think, in some way. Even if it's a limited way, anything can be helpful. And again, can help to reduce those behaviors, increase learning, increase the ability to effectively communicate. So many wonderful benefits to being able to have a real means of communication in whatever way is appropriate for that child.
I think, one of the things, speaking of evaluations, I've had parents tell me that, well, my district said it's not time yet. It's not, the 3-year triennial evaluation is not due. Well, I want you to know that you can ask for an evaluation at any time that there is a change, either in behavior, any type of change that's, impacting the ability to learn. You're entitled to ask for an evaluation. Now, I understand, of course, you're not going to ask for necessarily duplicative evaluations that perhaps, when looking at the data, it would be skewed because of the proximity of that particular test to another identical test. But for example, though, if you feel that, you need an assistive technology or adaptive technology assessment, you can ask for that at any time. And again, follow my rule, put it in writing. You can certainly make the phone call, but put it in writing, because you're entitled to ask for assessments. They're at the district's expense. Neurological assessments may also be implicated. Time and time again, I've had families come to me where they indicate that, the child was classified pursuant to a particular disability, but as time progressed, other disabling conditions started emerging and causing the family to suspect that there may be another disabling condition. Perhaps there was a misdiagnosis, maybe there's a dual diagnosis. Those are other opportunities where you can request an evaluation. A neurological evaluation is one of them. Oftentimes, parents don't realize that that's something that they can ask for, and don't take the word of the district that, gee, those are really hard to schedule, and there's a waiting list. That may be true, but you need to persist in that because you're entitled to it. And many times, a student who is suspected of having autism spectrum disorder is, that's really the way to determine whether that student has ASD. And, those are services that are very particularized. So if the student's been initially diagnosed or classified as eligible for special education under, oftentimes parents will tell me that the student was diagnosed with ADHD, but there may be other facets of disability like ASD. So that's something that parents need to look out for. Speech evaluations, I'm sure that's something, Melanie, that you encounter quite often. There can be some pushback, right, from districts that perhaps, they just say, no, we don't think so. But
yeah.
The IDA says, evaluations in all areas of suspected disability. So do you have any war stories to tell us?
Oh my goodness. So many. I'm trying off the top of my head, a situation where a parent wanted a reevaluation. The district said they were X amount of months behind in evaluations, and it would take them longer than 90 days to get to that evaluation. And, the parent appreciated the district's dilemma with trying to catch up on all the evaluations, but in the end, they're just concerned for their child, not for all the other children involved, and that's where it gets tricky. Like, you're advocating for your child. Maybe you even feel bad and you're like, well, I don't want my kid to be pushed to the front of the line, because what about all the other children that have been waiting? But it's really important to advocate. I've seen children not evaluated for 6 years, 9 years. So evaluations are supposed to happen triennially, right? Every 3 years. And I've seen preschoolers literally in 6th, 7th, 8th grades, children who were preschoolers and now in 6th, 7th, 8th grades who have not been reevaluated since they were in preschool, because they just kept rolling over the evaluations, essentially saying evaluations were not warranted. They were just going to continue services, which is kind of a horror story to me, because you're certainly not the same individual you were in preschool when you're 13, 14 years old. So it's really important that parents advocate for getting those evaluations when they're needed. I'm a big advocate for getting the triennials done and not just saying evaluations aren't warranted. I really like them done every 3 years, because children are so dynamic. Even if your child has an ASD diagnosis, even if your child has Down syndrome, intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, anything, whatever you name it, it's important to have the reevaluation done. Children are dynamic, and 99.9% of the time there will have been some some type of change. Maybe it's not measurable on a test. Maybe it's just functional where, oh, he's making more eye contact now than he was 3 years ago, or he's able to sit longer, or he's able to point to things more frequently. But I would say 99.9% of the time, regardless of the diagnoses, it is critical to have a reevaluation done at the triennial. And then obviously, as Arla was saying, if you feel it's relevant to do it in the middle of that, it's certainly within your right to ask for that.
Sure. And you mentioned that there could be some change, functional or otherwise measurable by a diagnostic tool. That's so important too, because the parent wants to have enough information so that those goals and objectives can be individually tailored to that student's needs. And I shudder to think about the situation you just mentioned, that it, was like 6 years or so, between the evaluations, because honestly, I don't see how appropriate goals and objectives could be crafted. And that's really a tragedy, and it really requires that families be vigilant about, what's going on and what's, and I think also, going back to the communication part at the IEP meetings, I think, a lot of times we look at the IEP form and, it has a lot of things in it that may not be understandable, may be complicated, or maybe, families are uncertain what those goals and objectives are supposed to be targeting, or what does it mean? What is the frequency? What is the significance of, 8 out of 10 times and 9 out of 10 or 7 out of 10? Absolutely ask questions. Utilize your IEP meeting as your, question and answer session, but follow up afterwards too, because the IEP meeting is not your only time where you can ask questions. Anytime, you're certainly allowed to ask questions. And you're not tied to that IEP necessarily for that 1 year period. If in fact you see that some things are not working, some things might be frustrating to the child, working collaboratively to figure out, how can we address the frustration? How can we address the behavior that's occurring? Because maybe something that's being presented is causing the student to feel like they have to respond physically to it or vocally that, is not necessarily appropriate for the context. So I think, a theme to take away today is the advocacy, information, collaboration, communication. And Melanie, I wanted to ask you, we're coming up to the summer. We talked about play therapy, but, are there ways that families can try to integrate some of the educational goals and objectives into sort of everyday living? I mean, let's say even a student that's in an extended year program, which may be only, 4 weeks long, the summer is a little bit longer than that. What other ways can families integrate learning opportunities to help reinforce skills, try to relearn and remaster skills that may have been lost during the past year? Do you have any suggestions?
Yes, there are so many great ways to do that over the summer and anytime. So I'm thinking, I love social communication is really my thing, and I love social communication. So I'll give you a couple of examples, brief examples, thinking about that. So for example, we talked, I think, briefly about initiating conversation and how important it is to be able to say, like, I want help or I need something. So parents might want to think about, and again, I recognize how challenging it is to support your child at home while maybe you're working, or you're working from home, you're working out of the home, you're navigating other children, your other children, your spouse, your pets, your, home life. Like, there's a lot to consider. So, these suggestions are meant to support families, but I can certainly appreciate, don't feel like you have to come away from this and say, oh, I need to implement everything. They're just things, hopefully, that will spark your imagination and think about how you might move forward with these in a way that's suitable for your family. But I'm thinking about initiation, one great way is if your child wants something and they want something, try perhaps, if it's appropriate to your child, not to fill in the blanks for them. So maybe you don't prompt I want cookie, please. You say, I want cookie, please, which is very classic. I want something, please. is very classic in speech therapy, I feel like. And for a lot of children who have autism spectrum disorder, a lot of times it's I want this or I want more or something similar. So thinking about what it might look like to wait, to pause and see if your child will say something or will point to the thing that they want. And that's not to say you're going to withhold the item, but maybe you both see it in the cabinet. Maybe it's out of reach or something. Again, this is just an example. And maybe you pause and or maybe you comment and, oh, I do see those cookies up there. And maybe your child can gesture perhaps, or can say cookie, or can make a noise that indicates that they would like a sound or something similar, that they want a cookie. But a goal of mine, I think, regardless of your goal for social communication or otherwise, would be to think about what it would look like to reduce prompting a little bit, to reduce verbal prompting, and maybe give a little more space for the child to maybe think of something on their own, which is tricky because a lot of the children we work with are very rote and very repetitive, and they receive intervention that is also rote and repetitive. So it becomes a little bit of a vicious cycle. And this is, I think, a larger topic than we have time for tonight. But the thought of of helping your child understand that they can think independently, that they can have ideas as simple as I really want a cookie right now, and I'm not sure how to convey that to my parent. And how can you support that? Can you pause a moment? Can you show them a picture of a cookie and maybe have them point to it first, but maybe without saying, point to the cookie, please, point to the cookie. Maybe you just hold the picture up. Maybe they point to it. Maybe they don't. And that's okay. You don't have to have this shouldn't be a 15-minute interaction where you're trying to get your child to do something to get the cookie, right? It could just be a few seconds. And if they don't do anything, that's okay. You can just support them and get them what they need. But this idea of really thinking about our children as being competent learners, really presuming competence and presuming that children want to learn and are able to and really want to have those rich interactions with us, but maybe aren't quite sure how to. So pausing is really helpful sometimes, not perhaps prompting as much. Sometimes providing a statement is really great, like, oh, I do see those cookies. And that kind of leaves a little window for the child to say something in response. Again, these are just general concepts, but perhaps some of them might work for, some of the families listening tonight.
It also might be helpful for families to discuss with their case manager or other members of the IEP team mini goals to implement over the summer. To reinforce learned skills, and that, really as that gap period that I kind of see where, the ESY has stopped and you basically have, a few weeks in August. And, during that couple of week period, you want to have your child, kind of hit the ground running in September. Some mini goals, talk over with your case manager to, implement, because that will be, getting that child back into a routine. So maybe talking about those types of issues with your case manager too, to have that child, start thinking, rather than just have a complete, unstructured August, in that interim period. I think some mini goals would be helpful too, in collaboration with your child study team, your case manager.
I love that idea.
And, one of the things I think is helpful is, depending on your school districts, we have many different individuals in our audience tonight that, come from different school districts. Each school district, I always like to say, has a different personality. But if you are aware of a program in your community that is not school sponsored, it's not provided by the school, but there are times where, you may be able to ask the school if they would either in part or in whole fund your child's participation. And if you can make an argument that, your child would benefit, and this is part of helping your child overcome some of the regressed skills and remastery of skills that have been lost over the past year, that's, again, like I always say, the squeaky wheel does get the grease. That's they could always say no. That's the worst case scenario. But asking whether or not there could be some either scholarship, whatever way they want to phrase it, some compensation to enable the child to participate in that. That's something else that you can take a look at. And then there are other resources. This is a hot topic. Learning loss. Everyone has experienced it. among school-age children. And I encourage everyone to, start reading some articles about it. There are various strategies out there. Melanie has some resources that she's going to make available to everyone. We can, through our facilitator of this program, we can reach out to participants with those resources that might be helpful to parents. Melanie, maybe just describe a couple of the resources that you're going to be able to point families in the direction of.
Absolutely. So there's a great website. There's lots of great resources out there, but just very quickly, a few of that I was thinking of that would be great for tonight. There's a website called Affect Autism. It's affectautism.com. Again, we will send out all those resources to you. But it's a wonderful, wonderful website created by a parent who has a child on the spectrum. And she has done so much in the way of self-advocacy. She has a really robust podcast where she has very unique guests that talk about sensory integration, sensory profiles, communication, school support, anything that could possibly relate to ASD, she has on her website. It's very, very rich, very just accessible. It's easy. There's like nice little PDFs where you can, with little takeaways from each podcast that she has, very, very easy to access. So that's a great resource. Also SPAN, the Parent Advocacy Network, which is based in Newark, is statewide. That's a wonderful resource for parents to call. They have a toll-free 800 number, which we will get to you. And that's a great resource if you're having concerns and you're not sure where to turn to. They can really be supportive. So those are just two great things. And again, we'll send those out to everyone, soon after this ends.
And I encourage everyone to look at your state's Department of Education website. In New Jersey, at least, there and other states, I'm aware that there have been informative webinars targeted for families. They're hour, half hour long, and just, additional information. One of the things I always say also is, information moves freedom forward. So, getting more and more information, learning about resources, learning about what your state is doing to help address this situation that's impacting students is really, very important. Your county superintendent may have programs. Your district may have programs as well. There's in New Jersey, there's something called the Bridge Year, which is open to students of all abilities. That may be appropriate. There are various things out there because everyone recognizes that students have been adversely impacted this year. So I encourage everyone to, look at really the obvious, your departments of education and so forth, and ask have a dialogue with your school personnel. They may have access to information that's not being necessarily publicly broadcast, but they might be able to inform you of additional services that can be offered by county or municipal sources to assist students in achieving their educational goals. So I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. It's been our pleasure to speak with you tonight. Melanie, thank you very much. You've given some really wonderful tips and explanations tonight. And we hope that we've answered your questions, but if there are any specific questions, I'm sure we can make available our email addresses so that you can send us a question in confidence, and we'd be happy to hear from you. So our administrator of this program, Taryn, I think we're going to close for tonight. I wish everyone a good evening. Melanie, good evening to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you, everyone.
And I think, Taryn, we're also going to offer a video or a copy of this in case anyone would like to review some of the suggestions